My grandpa left my brother house, my sister money, and I got an old shed. What happened next changed my life. I never thought I'd be sitting in a stuffy living room watching my family tear itself apart over a few pieces of paper. But here I was, the day after we buried Grandpa John, squeezed onto those uncomfortable antique chairs he never let anyone sit on when he was alive. Funny how death changes the rules. The family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, cleared his throat for what felt like the 100th time. His bow tie was crooked, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room being freezing cold. Nobody was making this easy for him. And to my grandson, William, I leave my house and all its furnishings, he read from the will. William, my older brother, straightened up in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. The house was worth at least $400,000 in today's market. To my granddaughter, Linda, I leave all my financial savings and investments. Linda's eyes widened. Everyone knew Grandpa John had been saving every penny since the 1970s. The old man lived like he was still in the Great Depression, reusing tea bags and keeping the thermostat at 62 degrees year-round. His portfolio had to be worth a small fortune. Then Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and continued, "And my grandson, Eric." "That's me." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. Grandpa John and I had spent countless weekends together. I was the one who visited him every Sunday. I was the one who fixed his leaky faucet when he couldn't afford a plumber. I was the one who listened to his stories about the war and his adventures afterward. Stories he'd tell me while we worked side by side in his old workshop. I leave my workshop property located at 1421 Pinewood Road. The room went silent for a beat before William snorted. "Seriously? That dump?" Linda couldn't hold back her laughter. "Eric in that old shack, a perfect match." I felt my face burning as the blood rushed to my cheeks. The workshop was just an old barn on a small plot of land outside of town. It had no plumbing, spotty electricity, and was filled with decades of Grandpa's half-finished projects and tools that were probably older than I was. My fingers curled into fists as I struggled to keep my composure. This had to be some kind of mistake. Grandpa John wouldn't do this to me. Not after everything we'd shared. The rest of the reading was a blur. I sat there numb as Mr. Peterson droned on about some minor bequest to distant relatives and a donation to the local Veterans Association. When it was finally over, I bolted outside, needing air that wasn't thick with greed and disappointment. Standing in the driveway, I closed my eyes and a memory hit me like a freight train. Grandpa and I, caught in a sudden downpour one spring afternoon, rushing to get his handcrafted rocking chair inside the workshop before the rain ruined the fresh varnish. We were soaked to the bone, and when the chair slipped from my grip and toppled over, breaking one of the rockers, I thought he'd be furious. Instead, he laughed until tears mixed with the raindrops on his weathered face. "We'll fix it together, Eric," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Everything worthwhile needs a little mending now and then." Linda's SUV door slammed behind me, jolting me back to the present. She strutted past in her designer heels, the kind she always made sure everyone knew the price of. "Don't look so heartbroken, little brother," she said with a poisonous sweetness. "Grandpa knew you couldn't handle anything of real value. At least now you'll have somewhere to play with your tools." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. What was the point? Linda had always been this way, ever since we were kids. She'd been working in finance for years, managing portfolios worth millions. Of course Grandpa would trust her with his money. And William? He'd gone to law school, become a partner at a prestigious firm. He had a family, a reputation. It made sense he'd get the house, the tangible legacy of the Campbell family name. What did I have? A general contractor's license and a reputation for being the family underachiever. The black sheep who chose to work with his hands instead of climbing some corporate ladder. As I watched them drive away in their luxury cars to their luxury lives, something inside me snapped. Not in the way that makes you scream or throw things, but in the way that straightens your spine and clears your head. I got into my beat-up pickup truck, the same one Grandpa John had helped me buy when I was 19, and started the engine. The familiar rumble beneath me was comforting, like an old friend telling me everything would be okay. Then As I shifted into drive, another memory surfaced. It was from just a few months ago, during my last visit before Grandpa's health took a turn for the worse. He'd been sitting in his favorite chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. His doctor would have killed him if he knew, looking at me with this strange intensity. "There's something waiting for you at the workshop, Eric," he'd said. "Something you'll understand when the time comes." I thought it was just the bourbon talking, or maybe the medication making him confused. But now I wasn't so sure. As I pulled away from the house that was now William's, I made a decision. I would go to that workshop. I would face whatever disappointing legacy Grandpa John had left me. Maybe there was more to this than met the eye. Maybe there was a reason he'd given his most devoted grandson nothing but dust and wood shavings. The drive to Pinewood Road took about 40 minutes, out past the edge of town where the suburbs gave way to scattered farms and undeveloped land. The workshop sat at the end of a gravel driveway, partially hidden by a stand of oak trees that had been there since before I was born. It looked exactly as I remembered it, weathered gray boards, a slightly sagging roof, and that hand-carved sign above the door that read, "John's Place," in Grandpa's unmistakable style. I sat in my truck staring at it, memories washing over me like waves. This place had been my escape growing up, my sanctuary from school troubles and family drama. It was where I'd learned to use my hands to create instead of destroy. But now it was mine, just mine, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. As I approached the workshop, key in hand, something glinted in the afternoon sun, a small brass plate next to the door that I'd never noticed before. It looked new, freshly installed. My heart pounded as I got closer enough to read the engraving. To Eric, who always saw the potential in rough lumber. The real treasure isn't always what it seems. I stood there frozen as the weight of those words sank in. What had the old man been planning? What game was he playing even from beyond the grave? With slightly trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and as I pushed the door open, the familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil enveloped me like an embrace. What awaited me inside? What secret had Grandpa John been keeping that would make sense of this bizarre inheritance? Whatever it was, I was about to find out, and something told me my life would never be the same again. The workshop door creaked shut behind me, and I stepped in the shadows of my inheritance, wondering if I was walking into a cruel joke or the greatest gift my grandfather could have possibly left me. The workshop was darker than I remembered. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I flipped the ancient wall switch. Nothing happened. Great. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight, sweeping it across the dusty interior. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of water dripping. Lots of water dripping. I aimed my light toward the ceiling and groaned. The recent storms had taken a toll on the old roof, and now water was pouring through in at least 3 different spots. One leak was directly above Grandpa's main workbench, soaking his vintage craftsman tools. I sprinted to action, grabbing every container I could find, old paint buckets, metal tins, even a cracked ceramic pot, and positioning them under the leaks. Then I scrambled to move the most vulnerable tools out of harm's way. By the time I finished, I was soaked through and breathing hard, my jeans and flannel sticking to me like a second skin. As I was moving the last of the hand planes, my foot kicked something under the workbench. I crouched down and pulled out a wooden box about the size of a toaster. It was beautifully crafted with dovetailed joints and an intricate maple inlay on the lid. Unmistakably Grandpa John's handiwork. There was a small brass lock on the front, but no key in sight. I sat on a nearby stool, the mysterious box in my lap, and looked around the disaster zone I'd inherited. What was I supposed to do with this place? I didn't have money for a new roof. My contracting business was just breaking even, and most of that income went toward my apartment rent and the payments on my truck. For a brief moment, I considered William and Linda's perspective. Maybe this place was worthless. Maybe Grandpa had been playing some cruel joke after all. But then my flashlight beam caught the brass plate by the door. The real treasure isn't always what it seems. I tucked the box under my arm and decided to return the next day with supplies. Whatever Grandpa's game was, I wasn't backing down yet. 3 days later, I found myself on the roof of the workshop, hammer in hand, replacing damaged shingles. The late April sun beat down on my back, and my t-shirt was soaked with sweat instead of rain this time. I'd sunk nearly $1,000, money I really couldn't spare, into materials for repairs. The electricity was back on, and the leaks were almost fixed. I was so focused on hammering that I didn't notice the car pulling up until a voice called from below. This place looks even worse in daylight. I peered over the edge to see Mrs. Grayson, my old high school shop teacher, shielding her eyes as she looked up at me. She had to be pushing 70 now, but she still stood ramrod straight, her silver hair cut in the same practical bob she'd had for decades. "Mrs. G, what are you doing here?" I carefully made my way to the ladder. Her John Campbell's grandson inherited this old place. "Figured it had to be you." She looked around with a critical eye. Good thing, too. Anyone else would have bulldozed it by now. As we walked inside, I explained about the will and my siblings' reactions. Mrs. Grayson snorted. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing, Eric. This place," she gestured around, "it's got potential, just needs the right hands." She patted my arm. "Your hands." Before leaving, she mentioned something that would change everything. The community center's woodworking program got shut down. Budget cuts. Got about 8 kids with nowhere to go now. An idea started forming in my mind. 2 weeks later, the workshop looked almost unrecognizable. I'd replaced the roof, fixed the windows, and cleaned decades of dust and cobwebs. Most importantly, I'd arranged the space to accommodate multiple workstations. Mrs. Grayson had spread the word, and now I had 6 teenagers signed up for afternoon woodworking sessions. They arrived on a Tuesday after school. Trevor was first, a lanky kid with perpetually narrowed eyes and a toothpick between his teeth. Mrs. G had banned the cigarettes he probably preferred. He circled the space, hands in his pockets. "Smells like old people in here," he muttered, kicking at a pile of sawdust. Next came Kevin and Mia, friends who barely spoke above a whisper. Kevin immediately gravitated toward a shelf displaying some of Grandpa's intricate carvings, his fingers hovering reverently over a chess piece. "Did you make these?" he asked, eyes wide. "My grandfather did. He's the one who taught me everything I know." The other kids filtered in. Zoe with her purple hair, the twins Jackson and Jason who couldn't sit still, and finally Darius, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd already had to grow up too fast. That first session was chaos. None of them had ever held proper woodworking tools before. Trevor almost took off a finger within the first 10 minutes. By the end, I was sweating more from stress than exertion. Grandpa would have run you all off his property with a broom by now. I joked as I demonstrated, for the 3rd time, how to properly use a hand plane. He had 0 patience for crooked cuts. To my surprise, they showed up again the next day. And the day after that, we started small, simple boxes, basic coasters, nothing fancy. Every mistake became a lesson. Every splinter, a badge of honor. Gradually, something magical happened. The workshop came alive again. 1 month in, I decided to aim higher. The local children's hospital had a fundraiser coming up, and I suggested we contribute handmade wooden toys as auction items. The kids were skeptical at first, but they warmed to the challenge. We settled on classic rocking horses, small enough to be manageable, but complex enough to showcase real skill. I found Grandpa's old templates in a drawer and made copies for everyone. As I demonstrated the techniques, muscle memory took over. My hands remembered what it felt like to work alongside Grandpa John. The way he'd guide my movements without words, his calloused palms steady against mine. The familiar rhythm of the tools against what became almost meditative. The kids noticed a change in me. "You get weird when you're making stuff," Trevor observed one afternoon. "Like quiet weird, happy weird." I hadn't realized it myself, but he was right. For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt centered. This wasn't just his workshop anymore. It was becoming mine. Ours. By mid-June, we had completed 8 beautiful rocking horses, each one unique. Mrs. Grayson arranged to have them displayed at the hospital benefit, with all proceeds going to the pediatric ward. I was so proud of what we'd accomplished that I invited my family to the event, hoping they might finally understand. Big mistake. The evening of the benefit, I was explaining the woodworking program to a hospital board member when I spotted William and Linda across the room. They wore matching expressions of disbelief as they examined our display. "You actually made these?" William asked when I approached, his tone suggesting he was waiting for the punchline. "The kids and I did," I confirmed. "From scratch." Linda picked up one of the rocking horses, Mia's creation with its carefully painted dapple gray finish, and turned it over carelessly. "Cute hobby," she said with a thin smile. "Though I don't see how this pays the property taxes on Grandpa's land." William nodded, suddenly all business. "That's actually why we came. The county reassessed the workshop property. It's zoned commercial now because of the road expansion. Tax bill's going to be about 4 times what it was." As if to emphasize his point, he accidentally bumped the display table, causing Kevin's rocking horse to fall. The hand-carved mane snapped off as it hit the floor. "Oops," William said, not bothering to pick it up. "Guess that's what happened to amateur work." I gripped the edge of the table, picturing all too vividly how satisfying it would be to swing one of Grandpa's antique hammers at my brother's smug face. But there were children present, my students, watching this exchange with wide eyes. "Send me the tax information," I said through clenched teeth. "I'll handle it." Linda laughed. "With what money? Your little toy factory here." She gestured dismissively at our display. "Face reality, Eric. You can't afford this place. Sell it to us now, and we'll give you a fair price before those taxes bankrupt you." After they left, I knelt to pick up the broken horse, carefully fitting the mane back into place. It would need glue and perhaps a small dowel for strength, but it could be fixed. As I examined the damage, I found myself remembering Grandpa's words from long ago. Everything worthwhile needs a little mending now and then. The kids gathered around me, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. "Were those really your brother and sister?" Darius asked quietly. "Unfortunately." Trevor snorted. "They're jerks." "Yeah," I agreed, standing up with the broken horse cradled in my hands. "But they're also right about one thing. Unless we figure out a way to make real money with this workshop, I might lose it." "So what are we going to do?" Zoe asked, her voice small. I looked at their faces, these kids who brought Grandpa's workshop back to life, who discovered talents they never knew they had, and I knew I couldn't let it end here. "We're going to prove them wrong," I said, more determination in my voice than I actually felt. "We just need to figure out how." As we packed up our remaining pieces that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Grandpa wouldn't have left me this place just to watch me lose it. There had to be more to his plan, something I hadn't discovered yet. Whatever that secret was, I needed to figure out fast if I want to save everything we built together in this workshop. The hospital benefit raised over $12,000 for pediatric ward, with our rocking horses bringing in almost a quarter of that amount. It was a feel-good story that should have ended there. But life had other plans. 3 days after the benefit, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first call came at 6:30 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this the guy who makes those wooden horses?" An excited voice demanded before I could even mumble a proper hello. "My sister needs one for her daughter's birthday next week. Name your price." I hung up, convinced it was a wrong number. Then another call came, and another. By noon, I had 17 voicemails, all asking about wooden toys. When Mrs. Grayson called, I finally got an explanation. "Check your email, Eric. Better yet, check social media." One of the hospital volunteers had posted photos of our rocking horses on her Instagram account. Her cousin, who apparently had some kind of parenting blog with a decent following, had shared them. Then a local mommy influencer with over 100,000 followers had reposted them, gushing about artisanal wooden toys and supporting local craftsmen. The post had gone viral overnight. "Handmade wooden toys from Campbell Legacy Workshop, where craftsmanship meets heart," read one caption. The comments section was overflowing with people asking where they could buy them. Campbell Legacy Workshop. I liked the sound of that. The next few weeks were a blur. We quickly ran out of rocking horses, so we pivoted to smaller items that could be made faster. Wooden pull toys, simple puzzles, and building blocks. Each piece featured our newly designed logo, a a stylized L that Kevin had sketched during lunch break. Our little group of teenagers became a well-oiled machine. Trevor, despite his perpetual scowl, had a surprising talent for precision cutting. Mia designed the most creative details. Darius could sandwich to a silky smoothness that felt almost impossible. Even the twins settled down when they had tools in their hands. But our success came with growing pains. We were in the middle of our biggest order yet, 50 custom toy sets for a boutique in Portland, when disaster struck. The ancient bandsaw that had survived decades in Grandpa's shop finally gave up. The blade snapped with sound like a gunshot, and a piece of it caught my forearm before I could move. "Dude, that looks bad," Trevor exclaimed, dropping the wood block he was measuring. I looked down to see my flannel shirt torn, revealing an angry gash on my forearm. The cut wasn't deep enough for stitches, but it definitely couldn't be ignored. I wrapped it with the cleanest rag I could find while Zoe ran for the first aid kit. "We need to shut down for today," I said, wincing as Zoe helped clean the wound. "But the Portland order is due in 3 days," Kevin reminded me, his voice tight with worry. "And we got those 30 building block sets for that mommy blogger, too." He was right. We couldn't afford to miss deadlines, not when we were still building our reputation. The property tax bill William had mentioned was very real. I'd received in the mail last week, and the numbers made my stomach churn. "I'll work late," I decided. "We can take turns on the other saw. It'll be slower, but we'll get it done." That night stretched into morning. The kids stayed until their parents texted, demanding they come home. Then it was just me, working by the glow of ancient shop lights, my bandaged arm throbbing in time with each cut of the saw. Around 1 a.m., I heard gravel crunching outside. Headlights swept across the windows, and for a brief, paranoid moment, I thought William or Linda had come to gloat over my predicament. Instead, Mrs. Grayson appeared at the door, carrying a thermos and a small toolbox. "Figured you'd still be at it," she said. "Pour me a cup of coffee that smells strong enough to strip paint. Drink this, then move aside and let someone who actually maintains their tools show you how it's done." She had brought a smaller bandsaw blade from her home workshop. Within an hour, she had our old machine running again better than before. "John always was too stubborn to replace things," she muttered, wiping grease from her hands. "Some traits run in the family, I see." By dawn, we were back on schedule. The Portland order shipped on time, and the blogger loved her building blocks. Orders continued to pour in. We raised our prices, hired 2 more local teens, and still couldn't keep up with demand. It should have been the happiest time of my life. Instead, I found myself looking over my shoulder more and more. It started with small things. A rumor circulating around town that our wood wasn't sustainably sourced. I personally visited every supplier. Then whispers that we were exploiting child labor. Absurd. The kids were all properly employed with work permits and fair pay. Then one day, Trevor's mom came to pick him up and mentioned something odd. "Your sister was at my salon yesterday," she said casually, asking all sorts of questions about the workshop, whether Trevor had proper safety training, whether I was concerned about him working with, and I quote, "obsolete and dangerous equipment." A cold feeling settled in my gut. Linda wouldn't visit a salon on our side of town unless she had an agenda. My suspicions were confirmed the following week when a health inspector showed up unannounced. He was apologetic but thorough, checking every inch of the workshop while explaining that they received an anonymous complaint. We passed the inspection, barely. I'd been meticulous about safety since day one, but the inspector left me with a list of recommended upgrades that would cost thousands to implement. As he was leaving, he hesitated by the door. "Just between us," he said quietly, "the complaint came from a law firm downtown, Pritchard and Associates. Thought you should know. William's firm." That same afternoon, I received a formal-looking envelope containing an offer to purchase the workshop property. The letterhead belonged to Midwest Development Group, a company I'd never heard of. The figure they proposed was generous, almost twice what the land was actually worth. Too generous. Something felt off. I did some digging online and discovered that Midwest Development had recently acquired several properties along our road. They were planning a large commercial complex, and my workshop sat right in the middle of their desired footprint. As I was researching the company, my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as Michael Reynolds, Vice President of Midwest Development Group. "Mr. Campbell, we're very impressed with what you've built," he said smoothly. "Our offer includes funds to relocate your operation to a more suitable facility. Plus, we'd be interested in discussing a partnership to expand your product line." It sounded perfect. Too perfect. Why the rush? I asked, "And why offer so much above market value?" There was a slight pause before he answered. "We value local businesses, and our timeline for breaking ground is accelerated." We talked for another 20 minutes. He outlined a vision where Campbell Legacy Workshop will become a regional brand with proper manufacturing facilities and distribution channels. They'd handle the business side. I'd maintain creative control. "Think it over," he said before hanging up. "This could be life-changing for you." It was tempting. Very tempting. The money would solve my tax problems instantly. The partnership would allow us to scale up production and reach more customers. But something kept nagging at me. As I hung up, I overheard another voice on the line. Someone who hadn't been introduced during our call. "He'll bite." They always do. The voice sounded familiar. The next day, I decided to visit Midwest Development's local office, which had just opened in a downtown building. As I approached the receptionist's desk, I heard raised voices from behind a partially open door. "We need that property, Reynolds. The access road is essential for the loading docks." My blood ran cold. I knew that voice all too well. "William." I backed away before anyone could spot me, my mind racing. This wasn't just a coincidence. William and possibly Linda were involved with Midwest Development's plans. They wanted my workshop, Grandpa's workshop, as part of their development deal. When I returned to the workshop, the kids were already there working on their projects. Trevor was teaching Zoe how to use the lathe. Kevin and Mia were collaborating on a new puzzle design. Darius was showing the twins how to properly apply finish to a set of blocks. They looked up expectantly when I walked in, and I realized something important. This wasn't just my workshop anymore. It belonged to all of us. What had started as a place to honor my grandfather's memory had evolved into something bigger, a community where these kids were finding their own voices through craftsmanship. Could I really sell that for a quick profit? As I pondered this question, a sleek black Audi pulled up outside. Michael Reynolds stepped out, looking every inch the successful executive in his tailored suit. But he wasn't alone. Linda emerged from the passenger side, her designer heels sinking slightly into the gravel driveway. The kids fell silent as the pair entered the workshop. Linda's gaze swept dismissively over our projects before settling on me. "Eric," she said with a tight smile, "Michael told me you two spoke yesterday. I thought I'd come along to help clarify the opportunity." "What a surprise," I replied, making no effort to hide my sarcasm. "I didn't realize you were involved with Midwest Development." Linda waved a manicured hand. "I've been consulting on their investment portfolio. When I heard about this project, I naturally thought of you." "How thoughtful." Reynolds cleared his throat, clearly sensing the tension. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" I nodded toward my small office at the back of the workshop. Once inside, Reynolds laid out architectural renderings showing a massive retail complex. Right where the workshop stood was a loading area and storage facility. "We need the specific location," he explained. "The grade of the land, the access to the main road, it's ideal for our purposes." "And what exactly are those purposes?" I asked, looking directly at Linda. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Progress, Eric. Development. The kind of business vision Grandpa John clearly thought you lacked." That stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "And your involvement? Just a coincidence." "Call it family looking out for family," she replied smoothly. "This deal solves your tax problems and gives you capital to start fresh somewhere else. It's win-win." Reynolds nodded eagerly. "We can close by the end of the month. You and your apprentices can be set up in a new location before fall." I studied the plans again, noticing something I'd missed before. The development would completely transform the area, turning this quiet stretch of road into a commercial hub. The character of the neighborhood would be lost forever. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Linda's smile faltered. Don't take too long. Offers like this don't come around every day, especially for people in your financial situation. After they left, I sat alone in the office, staring at their business card. The money would solve all my immediate problems. But at what cost? Outside, I could hear the kids working, their laughter occasionally rising above the sound of tools. They'd created something special here, something that went beyond mere woodworking. Could that be replicated in some sterile new facility? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Decision time, little brother. Smart people know when to cash out. I deleted the message without responding. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. My workshop, my kids, my grandfather's legacy, all of it hung in the balance. Whatever I decided next would change everything. The question was, would I stay true to what we built, or would I take the money and run? 2 days after Linda and Reynolds' visit, I was still wrestling with their offer when Mrs. Grayson dropped by with a newspaper tucked under her arm. Thought you might want to see this, she said, spreading out on my workbench. The local business section featured an article about small business grants being offered by the state's Economic Development Office. They were specifically targeting artisanal manufacturers who employed at-risk youth and veterans. Campbell Legacy Workshop checked every box. The grant application process was grueling. Mrs. Grayson and I spent late nights huddled over my laptop, crafting the perfect proposal. The kids contributed too. Mia took photos of our workspace and products, while Kevin created diagrams showing how we'd use the grant money to expand. 6 weeks later, an official-looking envelope arrived. I gathered everyone around before opening it, preparing them for disappointment. Instead, we erupted in cheers. The state had awarded us $75,000. The first thing I did was hire a contractor to repair the workshop's roof and reinforce its foundation. No more buckets catching rainwater during storms. Next came upgraded electrical systems and proper insulation. But the most exciting purchases were the new tools: a professional-grade bandsaw, a state-of-the-art lathe, and a dust collection system that actually worked. I was like a kid at Christmas, unpacking each piece of equipment with reverent hands. Trevor eyed the shiny new machines with suspicion. Does this mean we're going all factory style now? Mass production? I understood his concern. There was something special about the handcrafted nature of our work, something that connected us to Grandpa John and countless generations of woodworkers before him. The rocking horses stay handmade. I decided that's our signature item. Everything else, we'll use the machines to handle the rough work, but final shaping and finishing will always be by hand. Kevin nodded approvingly. Best of both worlds. With the upgrades in place, we could finally meet the growing demand. I hired 4 more teenagers in the high school, and, in a move that made me especially proud, 2 veterans who'd been struggling to find work after returning from overseas. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen too much. His hands were rock steady when working on detail carvings. James had lost his left leg below the knee, but navigated the workshop with a grace that put the rest of us to shame. Both men brought a level of precision and dedication that elevated everyone's work. Our team dynamic shifted. Trevor, Kevin, and the original crew naturally stepped into leadership roles, teaching the newcomers the Campbell Legacy way of doing things. I overheard Trevor telling a new kid, "Nah, man, that's not how we do it here. Wood has a voice, you gotta listen to it." The wisecracking teen had become a craftsman, and it nearly brought tears to my eyes. The grant also allowed us to launch a proper website. Kevin, who turned out to have hidden web design talents, created a beautiful online presence for us. We featured not just our products, but the stories behind them. The About Us page included a tribute to Grandpa John, complete with photos of him in the workshop. I wrote about his dedication to craftsmanship, how he believed that things made with care and attention would always find their way to people who appreciated them. At Mia's suggestion, we added profiles of each team member, highlighting their journey and specialties. The workshop stories section became particularly popular, with weekly updates about our projects and the occasional mishap, like when Marcus accidentally glued his phone to a toy train. Local media picked up our story. The headline in the Tribune read, "The workshop that builds more than toys, how Campbell Legacy is changing lives through craftsmanship." Orders doubled, then tripled. We were no longer just a curiosity. We were a brand. One rainy Tuesday, I arrive at the workshop to find a sleek black BMW parked outside. Linda sat inside, tapping impatiently on her steering wheel. When she spotted me, she stepped out, her designer umbrella unfurling to protect her perfect blowout. "We need to talk," she said, following me inside without waiting for an invitation. I busied myself turning on lights and checking the schedule for the day. About this. She tossed a magazine onto the workbench. It was a regional business publication featuring an article about Campbell Legacy Workshop. "You've been quite the busy little entrepreneur." I shrugged, just building something worthwhile. Linda paced a workshop, running a finger along a newly installed shelving unit. "William and I have been talking. This has clearly become a significant business operation, one that's trading on the Campbell family name and reputation." I could see where this was heading. Our point is that we deserve a stake in this enterprise. It's our heritage, too. The audacity nearly took my breath away. After months of them trying to sabotage my efforts, after their thinly veiled threats and maneuvers with Midwest Development, they now wanted a piece of what I'd built? "You've made it pretty clear what you think of Grandpa's heritage." I reminded her. "You called this place a dump. You laughed at his tools and his craft." Linda waved dismissively. "Business is business, Eric. Sentimentality is a luxury. The fact remains that Campbell Legacy Workshop exists because of Grandpa John's will, a will that divided his assets among all of us. And you got exactly what he wanted you to have." Her smile turned brittle. "Did I? Or did he simply not anticipate how you would leverage your modest inheritance?" I felt my patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you asking for, Linda?" "A 30% stake. For William and me to share, with appropriate positions on whatever board you eventually establish." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "Not going to happen." Her expression hardened. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable. But since you insist on being difficult," she pulled out her tablet and opened a spreadsheet. "Your revenue last quarter was approximately $127,000. Your expenses, including payroll, materials, and utilities, came to around $89,000. Your net was therefore in the neighborhood of $38,000. My blood ran cold. Those figures were accurate, eerily accurate. "How did you—" "Your new bookkeeper, Diane? Lovely woman. Very thorough. Very communicative." The implication was clear. Linda or William had gotten to our bookkeeper. They knew our finances inside and out. "That's confidential business information," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You've committed corporate espionage." Linda laughed. "Such dramatic terms. I prefer to think of it as family oversight. Get out. Think about our offer, Eric. 30% is very generous considering the alternatives." "Which are?" Her smile was cold. "An IRS audit can be devastating for a small business, especially one with so many unconventional employees. I wonder if you properly documented all those cash transactions from craft fairs." After she left, I called an emergency meeting with Marcus and James. As the only other adults on the team, they'd become my unofficial advisory board. "She's bluffing," Marcus said after I explained the situation. "The IRS doesn't just audit someone because a random person suggests it, but they might if that person is a finance executive with connections," James pointed out. "And even if they don't find anything serious, the process itself can be crippling for a small operation like ours." I ran my hands through my hair, frustrated. I refused to give them a stake in this. Not after everything they've done. "Then we need to protect ourselves," Marcus said, "starting with firing Diane and finding a bookkeeper we can trust." The next few weeks were tense. I half expected IRS agents to show up at any moment. Instead, we received a formal letter from Williams' law firm reiterating their demand for a 30% stake and threatening legal action if we didn't comply. I hired a lawyer of my own, not from a fancy downtown firm, but a scrappy local attorney named Sofia Rodriguez who specialized in small business defense. She worked out a converted house and charged reasonable rates, but her reputation for tenacity was legendary. "They don't have a case," she assured me after reviewing our situation. "The will was clear, and you've built this business through your own efforts. But they can make your life difficult with frivolous lawsuits and regulatory complaints. So what do we do? Document everything. And I mean everything. Every decision, every transaction, every employee interaction. Make it impossible for them to find any vulnerability." While this legal chess game was playing out, the business continued to grow. We received an unexpected boost when a popular parenting podcast featured our toys in their holiday gift guide, praising our commitment to non-toxic finishes and sustainable materials. Pre-orders flooded in, forcing us to institute a waitlist system. I hired 3 more staff members and extended our workshop hours. We were officially operating at capacity. That's when Midwest Development returned with a new offer, even higher than before. Reynolds didn't come himself this time, sending instead a junior executive who looked uncomfortable delivering the pitch. "Mr. Reynolds wanted me to remind you that this offer won't remain open indefinitely," he said nervously. "The development plans are proceeding with or without your property." I thanked him politely and added the new offer to my growing pile of paperwork. Every instinct told me to keep fighting, to protect what we'd built, but the pressure was mounting from all sides. It was Trevor who ultimately uncovered what was really happening. He'd been dropping off a special order to a customer who lived near the city planning office and decided to stop in to see if there were any public records about the Midwest Development project. He burst into the workshop that afternoon, out of breath and wild-eyed. "They're planning to bulldoze the whole area," he panted. "Like everything, 6 blocks worth. And guess who filed the original zoning request? Pritchard and Associates. Williams' firm. Again. But that's not the worst part," Trevor continued. "I overheard something. I know I shouldn't have been eavesdropping, but there was this guy arguing with someone on the phone in the hallway. He sounded super stressed, saying something about accelerating the timeline because one holdout was causing problems." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you hear anything else?" Trevor nodded grimly. "Yeah," he said, and I swear this is exactly what he said. "If Campbell won't sell, we'll have to consider more aggressive options." Reynolds mentioned something about insurance covering fire damage. A chill ran through me. "You're sure that's what you heard?" "Positive." And then, this is the really messed up part. I saw him meet up with your brother in the parking lot. They drove off together. The implications were staggering. William, my own brother, was potentially involved in a plot to commit arson if I wouldn't sell. It seemed too extreme, too criminal to be real. And yet, given everything that had happened so far, I couldn't dismiss it. I called Sophia immediately, who advised documenting Trevor's account and installing security cameras around the property. "Don't confront William directly," she warned, "if he is involved in something this serious. Tipping him off could make things worse." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and creations that had given my life new purpose. The rocking horses lined up against one wall seemed to watch me with their painted eyes, waiting to see what I would do. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Last chance. Accept our partnership or face the consequences." I turned the phone off without replying and walked the perimeter of the workshop, checking locks and windows. The place felt different at night, older, more alive. I could almost feel Grandpa John's presence, his spirit infused in every board and beam. "What would you do?" I whispered to the empty room. As if an answer, my flashlight beam caught the brass plate by the door. The one I discovered on my first day here. The real treasure isn't always what it seems. I'd been so caught up in the business, in the day-to-day challenges of growth and success, that I'd lost sight of what this place truly meant. It wasn't just about making toys or running a profitable enterprise. It was about craftsmanship, about creating things that would last, about passing on skills and values to the next generation. How could I protect all that from people who saw it only as real estate to be developed or a business to be exploited? The answer came to me slowly, a plan forming piece by piece. It would be risky, potentially costly, but it might be the only way to save everything that mattered. First thing tomorrow, I would put it in motion. But tonight, I needed to stay alert. If William and his developer friends were truly considering aggressive options, the workshop was in immediate danger. I made a quick call to Marcus and James, explaining the situation. Without hesitation, they offered to take shifts keeping watch overnight. Within an hour, they arrived with camping chairs, thermoses of coffee, and grim determination in their eyes. "No one's burning down our workshop," Marcus stated simply, settling in for first watch. As I drove home to grab a few hours of sleep before my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards some kind of final confrontation. William and Linda had drawn their lines in sand. Now I would draw mine. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or worse. The next morning, I arrived at the workshop before dawn, my plan taking shape with each passing minute. Marcus and James reported no disturbances during their overnight watch, but none of us believed the threat had passed. I made several calls before the rest of the team arrived. First to Sophia, then to Mrs. Grayson, and finally to the local newspaper. By noon, everything was in place. The city council meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. Normally, these meetings attracted only the most dedicated civic-minded citizens and those directly affected by the agenda items. But tonight, every seat in the council chambers was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I sat in the front row, surrounded by my workshop family, the teens, the veterans, and Mrs. Grayson. Across the aisle, William and Linda were huddled with Reynolds and several men in expensive suits. My siblings looked surprised by the turnout, exchanging nervous glances. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, running through routine business before arriving at the main event. Item 7, proposed rezoning of the Pine Creek District for commercial development. Reynolds approached the podium first, his presentation slick and polished. He showed architectural renderings of gleaming retail spaces, upscale restaurants, and landscape walkways. He touted job creation, increased tax revenue, and economic vitality. Midwest Development is prepared to invest over $50 million in our community, he concluded smoothly. All we need is council approval for this rezoning request. What he didn't mention, but what my research had uncovered, was that the proposed development would displace not just my workshop, but 12 other small businesses and 9 residential properties, most occupied by elderly residents on fixed incomes. When it was my turn to speak, I brought a worn leather folder to the podium. The chambers fell silent. My name is Eric Campbell. Many of you know me from Campbell Legacy Workshop. A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. 8 months ago, my grandfather, John Campbell, passed away. He left his house to my brother, William. He left his savings to my sister, Linda. And to me, he left his workshop, a place many considered worthless. I opened the folder and removed a handwritten letter. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. 3 days ago, I found this letter hidden inside an old rocking horse my grandfather had been restoring before he died. It was addressed to me. The letter had been tucked inside a small compartment carved into the horse's belly, sealed with a hand-carved wooden plug that matched the grain so perfectly I'd nearly missed it. My grandson, Eric. I read, "If you're reading this, then you've already begun to understand what I was trying to teach you all these years. The workshop goes to you not because it's worth less, but because only you would see its true value." I paused, gathering myself. My grandfather goes on to explain that he knew about the development plans years ago. He was approached multiple times with offers to sell, but he refused, not out of stubbornness, but because he believed that craftsmanship and community matter more than profit. I looked directly at William and Linda. He also writes that he suspected certain family members might try to force a sale after his death. That's why he structured his will the way he did. He knew who would value money over legacy. William's face darkened. Linda stared at her lap. What my grandfather couldn't have anticipated was how his workshop would grow into something that serves our entire community. We now employ 15 people, including at-risk youth and veterans. We provide educational programs and donate a portion of our profits to local charities. I then revealed what our investigative work had uncovered: the backroom deals, the pressure tactics used against other property owners, and environmental impact reports that had been conveniently overlooked. And most disturbing of all, I continued, we have evidence suggesting that when legal means of pressure failed, more drastic measures were considered, including the possibility of arson. A collective gasp filled the chamber. Reynolds leapt to his feet, protesting that such accusations were outrageous and unfounded. The mayor called for order. We have a witness who overheard discussions about accelerating the timeline through fire. I stated calmly. And we have security footage showing meetings between Midwest development representatives and parties who would benefit financially from forcing us out. I nodded to Sophia, who projected a still image from our newly installed security cameras. It clearly showed William getting into a car with the same executive Trevor had overheard discussing aggressive options. From that point, the meeting descended into chaos. Reynolds tried to salvage his presentation, but the damage was done. William stormed out, while Linda remained frozen in her seat, her face ashen. One by one, other affected business owners and residents came forward with their own stories of intimidation and pressure. The council chambers buzzed with anger and disbelief. Mayor Thompson eventually called for a vote to table the rezoning request pending further investigation. It passed unanimously. Outside the chambers, reporters surrounded me with questions. I answered as honestly as I could, emphasizing that my fight wasn't against development itself, but against the underhanded tactics being used to force it through. As the crowd dispersed, I spotted Linda standing alone at the edge of the parking lot. Something in her posture, a certain defeated slump of the shoulders, made me approach her. "Why?" I asked simply. She didn't look at me. It wasn't supposed to go this far. William said it was just business, that you'd take the money and move on. And the workshop? I never thought it meant that much to you, or to anyone. We stood in silence for a moment, the gulf between us seeming both vast and surprisingly narrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. Then she walked away. The following weeks brought wave after wave of change. The district attorney launched an investigation into Midwest Development's practices, with Williams' firm squarely in the crosshairs. Reynolds disappeared overnight, reportedly fleeing to a country without an extradition treaty. Our workshop became something of a local celebrity. Tourists started showing up, asking for tours. Orders poured in faster than we could fulfill them. In the midst of this whirlwind, Sophia called with news that left me speechless. "I've been digging into property records for your workshop," she explained. "Your grandfather didn't just leave you the building, Eric. He left you all 20 acres surrounding it." 20 acres? That can't be right. The workshop sits on maybe half an acre. The deed clearly includes the adjacent land parcels. Land that, I might add, is now prime real estate given its proximity to the interstate and the new hospital complex. My head spun. What's it worth? Her pause was dramatic. Conservative estimate? About $12 million. I nearly dropped the phone. "There's more," she continued. "The Mineral Rights Survey from the 1980s shows significant natural resources beneath the property. Your grandfather clearly knew what he was doing when he kept that land." Grandpa John's brass plate message suddenly made perfect sense. The real treasure isn't always what it seems. It hadn't just been about the workshop. It had been about the land itself, land that Grandpa had quietly accumulated over decades, parcel by parcel, knowing someday it would be valuable. 2 months later, I stood in front of our expanded facility. The original workshop remained intact. I wouldn't dream of changing it, but we'd added a larger production space to handle our growing orders. The expansion created jobs for 20 more local residents, including several who had lost their previous positions when other businesses in the area closed. A discreet sign by the entrance read, "Campbell Legacy Workshop, crafting tomorrow's heirlooms today." We'd signed contracts with 3 national retailers who appreciated our commitment to quality and ethical production. Our online presence had exploded after the rezoning controversy made national news, and our apprenticeship program now had a waiting list a mile long. As for William, his legal troubles were just beginning. The investigation had uncovered evidence of multiple ethics violations and possible criminal conduct. His reputation in tatters. He'd moved to another state to start over. Linda surprised me by requesting a meeting shortly after the mineral rights discovery became public. I expected demands or threats. Instead, she brought old photographs of Grandpa John that I'd never seen. Pictures of him as a young man working in the very same workshop he would eventually leave to me. "I thought you might want these for your website," she said awkwardly, "for the legacy section." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something. A small bridge across a deep divide. 1 year to the day after Grandpa's will reading, I held a celebration at the workshop. Everyone who had been part of our journey was there. The kids, some now graduated and working full-time with us. The veterans, Mrs. Grayson, Sophia, and even some of the city council members who had supported us. We unveiled a bronze plaque dedicated to John Campbell, mounted beside his original wooden sign. The plaque read, "He saw the treasure in both wood and people." Trevor, who had recently completed his GED and was now enrolled in business courses at the community college, raised his root beer in a toast. To Grandpa John, who knew what he was doing all along. Everyone cheered, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. This was what Grandpa had wanted for me, not just financial security, but purpose, community, a legacy that lived not in bank accounts, but in what we created with our hands and hearts. 5 years later, Campbell Legacy Workshop had become Campbell Legacy Craftworks, a nationally recognized brand with showrooms in 7 cities. We maintained our commitment to handcrafted quality and ethical business practices, turning down numerous buyout offers from larger corporations. I remained in the original workshop most days, leaving the business operations to those better suited for it. My hand belonged in sawdust, not spreadsheets. On a crisp autumn morning, I was working on a special project, a tiny rocking horse for my 2-year-old daughter, Johanna, named after her great-grandfather. She sat on a stool beside me, her eyes wide as I guided her small fingers over the wood. "Like this, Jojo," I said, helping her hold a sanding block. "Smooth strokes, following the grain. That's how Grandpa John taught me." She nodded solemnly, her face a picture of concentration that reminded me so much of the old man I'd loved. Outside the workshop windows, I could see our expanded campus, the education center where we taught woodworking to everyone from kids to retirees, the museum showcasing Grandpa's original pieces, the innovation lab where we developed new designs while honoring traditional techniques. All of it built on what once seemed like the least valuable part of Grandpa's estate. The irony wasn't lost on me. William had gotten a house, which he sold for a quick profit. Linda had gotten the savings, which she'd invested wisely but without passion. I had gotten the dusty old workshop and its surroundings, which had yielded both fortune and fulfillment beyond anything we could have imagined. As I watched my daughter's small hands learn the ways of wood, I understood the final lesson Grandpa John had tried to teach us all. True inheritance isn't what's handed to you. It's what you choose to build with it. Some people might say I got lucky, that finding valuable land and minerals under an old workshop was a windfall no one could have predicted. But I know better. The real treasure wasn't in the property values or mineral rights. It was in the legacy of craftsmanship, the joy of creation, and the community we built around it. In the end, I didn't just inherit a workshop. I inherited a way of seeing the world, where value isn't measured by market rates, but by the care put into creating something that lasts. Where wealth isn't just counted in dollars, but in the strength of the hands that build and the hearts that appreciate beauty in simple things. That is a legacy worth more than gold. That's the true inheritance my grandfather left me. And someday when Johanna is old enough, it's the one I'll pass on to her.